Hello, everyone. Today we'd like to talk about chapter 15, unemployment. Okay. So, in this chapter, there are several questions we try to find the answers. The first one is, how is unemployment measured? How we compute unemployment rate? Okay. What is the natural rate of unemployment? Okay. So, this is what we will focus on in this chapter, natural rate of unemployment. And why are there always some people unemployed? This is related to natural rate of unemployment, and we will talk about the three questions one by one. Let's look at the first one, labor force statistics. Every time when you see when the government report the unemployment rate, how does this rate come from? Okay, so labor force statistics collected by Bureau of Labor Statistics. So do you still remember this one? This agency also is responsible for collecting CPI, right, Consumer Price Index, and it was still based on a regular survey of 60,000 households. So you can notice either for CPI or like their labor force statistics, they are all based on survey, right? And it was based on adult population, which means the people who are already 16 years old or older. So we treat those adult populations as our potential workers. Everyone in the general population except for children under 16 years old or like active military personnel, or there are some institutionalized persons. For example, people who in the jail were excluded from labor force statistics. Okay, so there are three, except for these three categories, then the people we treat them as the potential workers. So the labor force statistics here, BLS divides the population into three groups. Pay attention. The first one will be people employed. So employee will be the paid employee, self-employee, or unpaid workers in a family business. So those people can all treated as employed category. Unemployed category will be the people who are not working, however, they are still active in job search. So this part is how people will compute unemployment rate. Unemployed should be the people they are not working but active in job search. If the people who lose the interest to find a job, then they cannot treat as unemployed because they will move on to not in the labor force. Okay, so pay attention to these three categories. Okay, the first category, employee, either for pay employee, self-employees, or you are unpaid workers but you are working in your family business. Unemployed should be the people who currently have no job but still active in job search. People who not in the labor force will be someone else, will be anyone else. Okay, so the labor force is the total of workers, including employed and unemployed. So here I would like to say labor force, including two parts, employee and unemployed. People, there are some people not in the labor force, right? There are some people who not in the labor force, and those people who not in labor force plus labor force will be in our total population. Will be our total population. Okay, so total population including two categories, labor force, not in the labor force. Labor force including two groups, employee and unemployed. Okay, I always see those characters will fade in my face. Okay, so let's see that this is the graph. Okay, I always say this is just a figure, shows the different combinations of the US populations of potential workers 2 years ago. You can notice the big green part. Okay, the big green parts will be the people who employed. Okay, And then the red part, okay, were the people who are unemployed, okay? The blue portion here shows the people who not in the labor force, so including the kids maybe under 16 years old, okay? All the people who are employed but they are not active in job search. So you can see this is general it show you the general combination of employee, unemployed, and not in the labor force. Then let's see how we can compute for unemployment rate. It's not hard for us to get an unemployment rate because unemployment rate will just equal sometimes we'll make it as U rate, okay? It will just equal people not people who are unemployed divide labor force. Okay, so U rate here will just equal unemployed divide labor force. Okay, this is the way that we compute for U rate, unemployment rate. Unemployed divides labor force. There is another one called labor force participation rate. So labor force participation rate would just equal total labor force, okay, divide population. Okay, this is the way that we can compute labor force participation rate. So these two rates are the only two rates that you need to compute in this chapter. Okay, these are the only two formulas you need to learn for this chapter. Unemployment rate will equal unemployed divide labor force. Okay, and labor force participation rate will equal labor force divide population. All right, now let's look at one example. So you can notice that those are some data that I get it from BLS, okay? In the United States in January 2020, the unemployment rate will equal 3.97%. Labor force participation rate will equal 63%, okay? This is in January 2020. And then you can see this is the example I give it to you about how to use these two formulas. So you can see the adult population in United States by September 2013, number of the employee here equal 144.3 million, okay? And then you have unemployed equal 11.3. You also have the people not in the labor force equal 90.6 million people, okay? So based on this information, can you compute the labor force, compute the unemployment rate, adult population, and the labor force participation rate? So I think from this table, it's easy for you to get labor force, okay? Because the labor force, according to this category here, labor force will just equal employee plus unemployed, right? So 144.3 plus 11.3. Okay, so that will be 155.6. And how about the unemployment rate? So U rate here would just equal unemployed 11.3 divided labor force 155.6 and then times 100%. So from this part, you can compute the unemployment rate. And then ask you to compute adult population. So adult population here, so I'll just write it down. Population would just equal labor force plus not in the labor force. So 155.6 plus 90.6. Okay. So this will equal 200. This is 2.6. It will be equal to 246.2 as the adult population. And finally, you can use the labor force 155.6 divide 246.2% times 100%. 0.2 and then times 100% here, use this one to get a labor force participation rate. Okay, so this one show you the US unemployment rate from 1948 to 2020. So you can see generally the United States unemployment rate were pretty stable. However, during the 2008 financial crisis and just at the beginning of the pandemic, you can see the unemployment rate was just skyrocket high, especially at the beginning of the pandemic is as high as 15%. So you can see this is some labor force statistics, okay, by education level. You can notice that in April 2021, people with people who have the education less than high school, the unemployment rate was as high as 8.2%. Labor force participation rate was just only 44.5%. Okay, people with high school diploma, okay, the unemployment rate is 6.7%. And then if people has associated grade, then the unemployment rate reduced to 5.7%, 5.9%. And if people have bachelor degrees or even higher, then the unemployment rate will reduce to 3.8%. You can see even during the pandemic, people with higher education level, the unemployment rate was much, much lower than the people who have never attend the college or universities, right? All right, and thus you can see the labor force participation rates by gender from 1950 to 2020, and then it also has projected, okay, expectations maybe to 2015 to 2050. So you can notice at the beginning of 1950 there is a big gap between genders for the labor force participation rate. However, you can notice male labor force participation rate is always higher than females' labor force participation rate. However, the gap shrink dramatically as time goes on. Okay. So this will just show you the U.S. labor force participation rate by gender, and you can see the gap will still be shrinking as time goes on, but the females' labor force participation rates still lower than male labor force participation rate. Okay, now let's look at one example of talking about the limitation, some drawbacks of unemployment rate. In which of the following scenario, what happens to the unemployment rate? Does the unemployment rate will give you an accurate inspiration or impression of what happening in the labor markets? Let's look at the first one. Sue lose a job and begin to look for a new one. This will definitely increase the unemployment rate, right? Because she just lose the job, and then but she is still active finding for jobs, which means she will count it for unemployment, right? How about the second one? John is a steel worker who has been out of the work since his mill closed last year and become discouraged and give up looking for work. What happens in this case? Before he is counted as unemployed, right? But now he just become discouraged and give up looking for a job, which means he is now moving from labor force category to not in the labor force category, and which will definitely give you some false information about unemployment rate because John was no longer counted as unemployed. He will just exclude from unemployed, which means it will reduce the employee worker numbers, right? Therefore, in this second case, it will give you some false information about unemployment rate because now currently the unemployment rate cannot truly reflect what happens to job situation. Sam is the sole earners in his family of five just lose a job of $80,000 as a research scientist. Immediately, he took a part-time job in a McDonald's until he can find out a job in his field. What happens to unemployment rate? You can see Sam has a full-time job, $80,000, right, per year. But he loses a job, but he immediately find a part-time job in McDonald's. So you can see unemployment rate in Sam's case actually doesn't change because the people who counted in employee could be self-employee, could be full-time employee, could be part-time employee, right? So in the third case for Sam, actually nothing changes in unemployment rate. However, we can definitely notice the living standard for Sam family would definitely decrease. So there, those are just three examples reflects the limitations for unemployment rate. Okay, especially for the second example and the third example. What does unemployment rate really measures? Okay, so the unemployment rate is not a perfect indicator, not a perfect indicator for jobless or the health of the labor markets. It excludes discouraged workers like John in the second case. It doesn't distinguish between full-time job and part-time job, and people who work part-time maybe because of the full-time job just not available. Okay? Some people might misreport their work status during the survey because our data were collected based on survey, right? So those are some shortcomings comes from unemployment rate. Despite for those issues, we still treat the unemployment rate as a very useful indicator, okay, of the labor market and economy. So currently, we can notice if you hear from the news or if you saw the news online, you can see okay, our labor market is still very strong because the unemployment rate was much lower than economists expect. Okay. Now let's look at business cycle. Actually, we talked about business cycle several times. Okay, and here we will just try to link this business cycle with unemployment. Business cycle is a series of stages in economy as expense or contracts. Okay, so it can become prosperous, and sometimes we know the economy will have recessions, but after that it will recover. So this is what we call a business cycle. It is primarily measured by the rise and decrease of the GDP. In the United States, business cycles are determined and measured by National Bureau of Economic Research. And this National Bureau of Economic Research, they use quarterly GDP, okay, the quarterly GDP growth rate to identify if the business cycle. If the quarterly GDP growth rate become positive and is higher than before and then the previous quarter, then we know the economy is on the upturn. However, if the growth rate become negative or slow down the growth rate of the GDP, then we notice now the economy will be moving into recession. The National Bureau of Economic Research also look at other economic indicators such as real income, retail revenues, employment, and manufacturing outputs together with the GDP growth rate to determine the business cycle. So you can see this is the typical business cycle. It had expansion, economy will expand until reach the peak, and then it will contract until reach the trough. Okay, so this is what we said. It's very normal in economy. Economy cannot always expand. You will expand and then reach the highest point, and then you will slow down until reach the lowest point. So lowest point could be the recession, serious recession, and then the economy will start recovering. Okay. So why we talk about business cycle? Because business cycle would definitely affect unemployment. So you can notice for the unemployment, we divide unemployment during the recession into three parts. During the recession, unemployment has three parts. The first one, the biggest part, comes from cyclical unemployment. And this cyclical unemployment related to business cycle, which means now the economy is in a recession. and recession result in the serious unemployment. And then we also have two parts of the unemployment, which is very natural: structural unemployment and fictional unemployment. So we would like to say cyclical unemployment was really bad because it related to recession, related to very bad economic situation. However, for structural or frictional unemployment, that's very natural. Okay. So when we talk about natural rate of unemployment, when we talk about natural unemployment, we only mention the unemployment with structural unemployment and frictional unemployment. These two types of unemployment always happens no matter how good your economy is. Okay, no matter how good economy is, these two types of unemployment always exist. I will explain these two unemployment one by one. So let's look at cyclical unemployment versus natural rate. There will always some unemployment through although the unemployment will fluctuate year to year. Okay, so you can see this is the natural rate of unemployment. It's just the normal rate of unemployment around which the actual unemployment rate will fluctuates. Cyclical unemployment was not good unemployment because it shows the deviation of unemployment from its natural rate. So you can see always associated with business cycle, especially when the economy go into a downturn. Okay, contracts and reach the trough, then we can notice the cyclical unemployment will become even worse when the economy during the Great Recession. You can see this blue line here, okay, this blue line here shows the natural rate of unemployment, which is just very natural, including these two parts. However, if unemployment rate will fluctuate around this natural rate of unemployment, and then they fluctuate. You can see during the 1980, okay, during the 1980s to 1985, during that period, time period, especially the 1970s to 1985, during that period, American suffers really bad all-year crisis. Okay, and during that time you can see the unemployment rate was super high, like is even higher as 11%. Okay, and then during the financial crisis from 2008 to 2010, you can also notice the unemployment rate really high, right? It shows a high deviation from the natural rate of unemployment. So even for now, just beginning at the beginning of the pandemic, the unemployment rate was as high as 13.7%. But now the unemployment rate was pretty good because it goes down as lower as 3.6%. So let's just in this chapter, okay, in this chapter we will more focus on natural rate of unemployment. So even when economy is doing well, there is always some unemployment, including two parts. Okay, frictional unemployment occurs when workers spend time searching for a job that best suits their skills and tastes. So, for example, after you graduate, you are in the job market, right? You need to search for the job that really can satisfy your needs and your majors, maybe your interest. Therefore, the time that you're spending for search, at that time you count it as unemployed, right? However, it's just a frictional unemployed. Okay. Short term, it will be very short for most of the workers because you spend maybe less than 4 months to find a new job. Structural unemployment. Structural unemployment comes from structural unemployment comes from there are fewer jobs than workers, and structural unemployment always comes from the labor market demand and supply. Okay, the wages. So usually the structural unemployment, this will be the long term. We will talk about some example for structural unemployment later. And the short run for the short term, frictional unemployment, this part is easy to tackle with. However, for structural unemployment, it's a little bit hard for government to tackle with this part. Let's look at a job search. So job search, okay, job search belonging to frictional unemployment. Workers have different tastes, have different skills, have different interests, right? And jobs also have different requirements. Therefore, it need to spend some time to match the job vacancy and the job candidates. Job search is the process of matching workers with appropriate jobs. Therefore, it's very natural. Okay, it's very natural. Sectoral shift will be another one. Sectoral shifts, okay, are the change in the composition of demand across industries and regions of the countries. Therefore, currently, probably we will not need people who help us to typing. I mean, for the typing machine, right? We don't need a typing machine anymore, probably. Therefore, the people who work in the traditional typing machine industry, they will maybe be laid off during the sector shifts. However, government they can provide their job training program to help the people who maybe get laid off from the traditional typing machine industry to become more competitive in the job market. So this type of the shift, okay, disappraise some workers, disappraise some workers who must search for a new job appropriate for their skills and tastes. So those like the job search or sectoral shifts were very natural during the industry development or during the searching for a job. Okay, so those two type of the changes we count it as frictional unemployment. Economy is always change, so some frictional unemployment is always exist. Okay, always exist. Now let's look at some public policies and job search. How public policies can reduce frictional unemployment. Government agencies can provide information about job vacancies, and that can reduce some misinformations between job vacancies and then the job candidates. Public training programs can help people who might be laid off from the sectoral shifts to learn new knowledge, new skills, and help them to become competitive in the job market again. So those are some policies that can offered by government. Okay, try to reduce the frictional unemployment. You know that government sometimes will government will offer the unemployment insurance, right? If you just become laid off, then you don't need to worry about, okay, I will have no incomes in the next couple of months because government will have the unemployment insurance. So unemployment insurance is a policies that can protect workers income when they become unemployed. A typical worker covered in the US, I mean the typical workers can receive 50% of their former salaries for 25 weeks. Oh, sorry, for 26 weeks. So you can see 26 weeks, nearly 7 months, right? 6 months and 6.5 months. So if you become laid off, then unemployment insurance can cover 50% of your former pay for nearly 6.5 months. And that will give you some income securities. You don't need to still worry about income while you're looking for a job. The benefits of the unemployment insurance would definitely can reduce the uncertainty over incomes, right? And it can give the unemployed more time to search for a job, result in a better job match, and result in higher productivity. Okay, so these are the two major advantages with unemployed insurance. Can you think about some drawbacks of the unemployment insurance? The biggest drawback of unemployment insurance is it will probably it will also discourage workers to find a job immediately, right? So unemployment insurance increases frictional unemployment because what? People who receive the unemployment insurance, they will have no incentive immediately to search for a job, right? So unemployment insurance, we know it has very good benefits, but it also will increase the frictional unemployment in the short run. Now let's look at structural unemployment. So we said the structural unemployment will be the long term, and then it comes from demand and supply. Okay, demand and supply in the labor market. You can notice we have the quantity of the labor force in the horizontal axis and wage on the vertical axis. Demand side downward sloping and then supply side upward sloping. Okay, through the intersection we can have the equilibrium wages, right, and equilibrium quantity. So structural unemployment, this is also very natural and it's long term because the unemployment, the inequality in because of the, I would like to say is unequilibrium point. Okay, the wages above equilibrium, the wages above the equilibrium wages, which will result in there always some actual supply of labor force in the market. So structural unemployment occurs when there are not enough jobs to go around, which means now wages higher, more people would like to work, however, not enough job vacancies. So it occurs when wages above equilibrium wages. So you can see when the wages above the equilibrium wages, then it always has some workers cannot find a job, right? And this is the long-term effect. We would like to say why the wages might above this equilibrium wages. Some reasons. The first one is very, very straightforward, will be the minimum wage. So in chapter 6, we know that minimum wage is regulated by federal government, right? And each state, they can have their own minimum wage laws. Employers, they cannot pay you lower than the minimum wage because that's illegal. So the minimum wage always above the equilibrium wages, okay? Minimum wage above the equilibrium wage, and which will result in the surplus in the labor market. So the minimum wage might exceed the equilibrium wage for the lower skilled workers, especially for people without the high school diploma. Okay, so we're causing their structural unemployment. But this group, I mean, resulting from minimum wage is not like a huge group. Okay, it's a small proportion because now many states they hire the workers that probably will pay the workers their wages higher than the minimum wage. So, but still, minimum wage laws can explain part of the structural unemployment, especially for the low skilled workers. Unions could be a big reasons. Unions could be a big reasons for the structural unemployment because the people in the union, because the union can represent the people to negotiate for a higher paycheck, higher salaries, and better benefits, right? However, people outside the union, they can have those advantages, right? So it will result in some differences between inside and outside the union, and that will also result in structural unemployment. Unions is the worker association that bargaining with the employees over wages, benefits, and working conditions. Unions would put their power, okay, to negotiate for a higher wages for workers. If not, the workers might own a strike, right? So the typical union workers will earn 20% higher than the people who are not in the union. And that will make the wages above the equilibrium wages and then result in structural unemployment. So when union raise the wages above equilibrium quantity, above equilibrium, quantity of the labor demand decrease and unemployment rates will increase. Insider means the people in the union, okay? They can enjoy probably higher paycheck, the better benefits. For the outsiders, they might lose their job and become worse, okay? So some outsiders will go to non-unionized labor market, which will increase the labor supply and reduce the wage in those markets. This could be a question that always argued by economists. Are unions good or bad? People in a union, they enjoy the benefits, right? However, people outside the union, they probably need to bear the bad situation or bad conditions. So the people who the economists who always like say, okay, union probably not a good idea because union or like a cartel. Do you know the OPEC? OPEC we treat it as a cartel as well because it control the majority of the oil supply in the world, and then union similar control the majority supply of the workers in some certain fields. Unions will raise the wages above the equilibrium wages, and which will cause the structural unemployment, or it will maybe depresses the wages in the non-union labor markets. However, people who some economists they advocates for union because they say unions will counter the market power for larger firms and make firms more responsive to workers' concerns. So, for example, before the Uber, the Lyft, or the delivery drivers for Amazon, there is no unions to protect them, so their pay could be really low. However, though now the Uber driver, the Lyft driver, or even for delivery driver for Amazon, Walmart, or Targets, okay, the workers they form the union, and then that union to negotiate their pay, their benefits with those large companies, and then to make sure that they can have a better pay. So those are some disadvantages and advantages with unions. But with union, we definitely know that union will result in structural unemployment. Now let's look at the third reason comes from efficiency wages. Efficiency wages always provided by firms and corporations because the efficiency wages can allow firms, okay, to voluntarily firms will voluntarily pay the wages above the equilibrium wages to boost workers' productivity. So if I give you a better pay, can you increase your productivity? Yeah, maybe give the workers more incentive to work better and then to put more efforts. Different versions of efficiency wages theories will suggest different reasons why firms will pay high wages. However, this no matter what type of efficiency wages that firms will adopt, it will result in structural unemployment because they will put the wages higher than equilibrium wages. And there are some reasons that the firms would like to pay for workers with efficiency wages because of the workers' health, for the workers to reduce the workers' turnover rate, and then to have better worker, okay, to hire better workers, and then to encourage workers to put more efforts. So those are some reasons that will result in efficiency wages. And now let's look at the summary, okay, about the natural rate of unemployment. So natural rate of unemployment including two parts, frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. So for frictional unemployment, including two parts, job search or sectoral shifts will result in frictional unemployment. Government policies can help to reduce the short-term frictional unemployment. However, unemployment insurance might increase the frictional unemployment. Okay? For the structural unemployment, this will be the long-term impact because it comes from the demand and supply of the labor markets with the wages or above the equilibrium wages. Several reasons will result in structural unemployment. Minimum wage law, right? Unions and efficiency wages. So In the later chapter, okay, we would like to talk about another type of unemployment, which is the unemployment related to business cycle. And that will be talked about probably in chapter 20 and 21. Okay, thank you so much.